For 2,555 days, I was the silent architect of Mark's empire. I managed his taxes, orchestrated his promotions, and sacrificed my own dreams to fuel his. Then he destroyed it all with 8 devastating words. We were sitting in the kitchen I designed, drinking the wine I chose. When I finally brought up the future, the marriage we had been building toward for 7 years, Mark didn't even look up from his phone. He just let out a sharp, mocking laugh that turned my blood to ice. "Are you joking, Sarah? We aren't even that serious." He dismissed 7 years of my life as not serious. He viewed my devotion as nothing more than a convenient arrangement. In that heartbeat, the woman who loved him died, replaced by a cold, surgical clarity. I realized I wasn't his partner. I was a high-level executive working for free for a man who didn't know my worth. I didn't scream that night. I didn't break a single plate. I simply gathered my life, left a short note, and walked out of that house forever. But the story doesn't end with my departure. Only 72 hours later, while Mark was smugly waiting for me to come crawling back, his world collapsed. An engagement announcement hit the headlines, me, radiant, standing next to his most powerful rival, a man who finally knew a diamond when he saw one. Don't turn away, because what you're about to witness is more than a breakup. This is a masterclass in psychological reclamation. You are about to see how a brilliant woman takes back every ounce of her power, leaving a traitor to drown in the ruins of the life he took for granted. Stay until the end, because you'll learn exactly why the most dangerous person on earth is a woman who has finally mastered the art of silence. My name is Sarah. I am 38 years old, and for most of my adult life, I have operated as a high-level instructional designer and tax consultant. My world is one of logic, meticulous planning, and the optimization of complex systems, a skill set that has made me incredibly successful in the boardroom, but as it turns out, dangerously invisible in my own living room. To anyone looking in from the outside, Mark and I were the ultimate power couple. He was the charismatic face of a thriving real estate development firm, always impeccably dressed, his speeches flawlessly written, and his business decisions seemingly guided by an uncanny intuition. But if you pulled back the curtain, you would find me. I was the silent engine, the invisible architect who had spent the last 7 years drafting the blueprint of his existence. I didn't just live with Mark, I managed him. Every morning, his day was laid out in a digital calendar I curated to maximize his productivity and minimize his stress. I was the one who sat up until 2 in the morning navigating the labyrinth of his company's tax audits, finding the legal deductions that saved him hundreds of thousands of dollars. I managed his investment portfolio with the precision of a hawk, shifting assets and hedging risks to ensure that his wealth grew while he played golf with clients I had spent months vetting for him. I treated his life like my most important project, applying the principles of instructional design to every facet of our home. I streamlined our chores, automated our finances, and even scripted his difficult conversations with his board of directors. I did it all because I believed we were a team, a single entity moving toward a shared horizon. In the language of my profession, I had performed a massive emotional and tactical audit of my own life to ensure his remained in the black. 7 years is a long time to stay in the shadows, but I told myself that my time would come. I remembered the day 3 years ago when I was offered a senior vice presidency at a firm in Chicago. It was a dream role, the kind of career-defining leap that happens once in a decade. But Mark's office was here, and his momentum was just building. He had looked at me with those eyes that I then believed were full of love, and told me he couldn't imagine his life without me by his side, so I declined the offer. I reinvested that ambition into him. I became a tax consultant for his heart, pouring 100% of my emotional capital into what I thought was our joint account. I thought I was building equity in a future together. I didn't realize that while I was depositing every ounce of my soul, Mark was keeping his assets strictly private. I was the one who had deferred my milestones, softened my needs, and accepted his ambiguity as a sign of his focus on us. I had become a utility, a highly efficient, self-maintaining piece of software that kept his world running without him ever having to acknowledge the source code. The realization didn't hit me with a bang. It arrived in the terrifyingly calm atmosphere of a Tuesday evening. We were in the kitchen, a space of granite and stainless steel that I had spent months renovating to his exact tastes. Mark was scrolling through his phone, barely tasting the sea bass I had prepared. I had been thinking about our anniversary, about the fact that we were approaching a decade together, and for the first time in years, I allowed myself to speak about a permanent structure for our lives. I asked him quite calmly what he thought about us finally making things official about marriage. Mark didn't even flinch. He didn't even look up. He just let out a dry, dismissive chuckle that made the air in the room feel suddenly thin. He told me that our relationship was like a legacy system. It was perfectly functional, it got the job done, and there was absolutely no reason to go through the headache of an upgrade. He said it as if he were discussing a piece of office equipment. He told me I was great exactly where I was, and that bringing marriage into the mix would just complicate a convenient arrangement that was working for him. He treated my heart like a nuisance, a bug in his otherwise flawless operating system. He wasn't even angry. He was just bored by the suggestion. It was in that moment of chilling clarity that I realized he didn't see a partner when he looked at me. He saw a service provider. He saw a woman who would always be there to fix his problems and handle his paperwork. Someone who didn't need a future because she was too busy maintaining his present. The man I had spent 7 years building up looked at me and saw nothing but a tool he had finished using for the day. I looked at the man I had sacrificed a career for, and for the first time I saw the hollow space where his gratitude should have been. Sarah didn't cry, she didn't scream. Instead, she opened her laptop and began a new file titled Project Termination. The blue light of the laptop screen was the only thing illuminating the kitchen, casting long, sharp shadows against the cabinets I had meticulously organized by frequency of use. Project Termination was not just a title. It was a declaration of war fought with the weapons I knew best: data documentation and the strategic withdrawal of resources. For 7 years, I had been Mark's primary infrastructure, the invisible foundation upon which his entire lifestyle was built, and now I was going to dismantle that foundation brick by brick without him even feeling the tremor. I began with the digital audit, my fingers moving across the keys with a cold, rhythmic precision. I systematically revoked the power of attorney I had held over his personal accounts, a document he had signed years ago because he found the minutiae of wealth management too tedious to bother with. I reset the passwords to the shared cloud drives, the ones containing the intricate tax spreadsheets, the property maintenance schedules, and the contact lists for the elite contractors who only answered his calls because I had cultivated the relationships. I watched as the permissions changed effectively, locking him out of the very systems that kept his world turning. It was a strange realization seeing it all laid out in rows of code and encrypted folders. Mark didn't actually know how to survive his own life. He didn't know the expiration dates on his insurance policies, he didn't have the login for his primary mortgage portal, and he certainly didn't know that his quarterly tax estimates were due in precisely 14 days. To him, these things simply happened by magic, a celestial clockwork he took for granted. I wasn't just leaving a man, I was withdrawing the operating system from the hardware. For the next 14 days, I wore the mask of the perfect partner with a commitment that would have earned me an Oscar. This was the quiet quit the stage of the relationship where the heart has already vacated the premises, leaving only a polite, efficient shell behind. I woke up at our usual time, prepared the artisanal coffee he liked, and listened to him drone on about his latest land acquisition with a smile that never quite reached my eyes. Inside, I was a ghost watching a stranger. Every time he spoke, I saw a person who had looked at 7 years of my devotion and called it a legacy system. Yet he still expected me to iron his shirts and remember his mother's birthday. I did those things, but I did them with the detached grace of a professional consultant, fulfilling the final days of a notice period. While Mark was at the office, I was orchestrating a ghost move. I didn't take the grand furniture or the expensive art we had bought together. Those were just things, and I wanted a clean break. Instead, I selectively packed the items that were truly mine: my grandmother's silver, my professional certifications, and the small personal treasures that had been buried under the weight of his ego. I moved them to a secure storage unit in increments a few boxes every morning after he left for work. I was erasing myself from the house in layers, thinning out my presence so gradually that a man as self-absorbed as Mark would never notice the shelves becoming lighter or the closets gaining more air. The tension of those two nha was a high-wire act. There were moments when I wanted to scream, to ask him how he could be so blind to the fact that the woman who had carried him for a decade was now a hollowed-out version of herself. But I knew that confrontation was a gift I no longer owed him. If I gave him an argument, I gave him a chance to manipulate the narrative to turn my valid pain into a hysterical outburst he could dismiss. Silence was my only true leverage. I watched him across the dinner table, realizing that he was so comfortable in his entitlement that he couldn't even sense the chill of my departure. He assumed my quietness was just a phase, a temporary glitch that would resolve itself once he gave me a crumb of attention. He was so convinced that my presence was a permanent fixture that he stopped looking at me entirely. I was just part of the furniture, as reliable as the heating system and just as easily ignored. It was the ultimate irony. His absolute belief in my submissiveness was the very thing that allowed me to plan his downfall in plain sight. The end came on a Saturday timed to coincide with the annual invitational golf tournament. It was an event he only secured an invitation to because I had spent 3 years handling the pro bono tax work for the club's board president. Mark spent the morning obsessing over his swing, completely unaware that the woman handing him his lucky visor was actually handing him his final farewell. After he drove away in the car I had arranged the lease for, I moved with a speed that was both terrifying and liberating. The remaining boxes were loaded into a prearranged van within 2 hours. I didn't leave the house in a mess. I left it in a state of clinical perfection. I scrubbed the counters, fluffed the pillows, and ensured that everything was exactly where he expected it to be. The only thing missing was the soul of the home. I walked through each room one last time, feeling nothing but a profound sense of relief. I had left the keys on the kitchen island right next to a single cream-colored envelope. Inside was a note that was strictly professional, written in the tone of a resignation letter. I didn't mention the 7 years. I didn't mention the not serious comment. I simply stated that my consultancy in his life had reached its natural conclusion and that all handover materials had been filed according to the digital protocols he no longer had access to. I took the manual, the knowledge, and the care. I left him the shell. Mark returned home that evening, flushed with the high of a good game, expecting a celebratory dinner and the usual adulation for his performance. But instead, he found a house that was physically full, yet hauntingly empty. The silence that followed my departure was not empty. It was a deafening structural collapse that Mark was entirely ill-equipped to survive. For the first 72 hours, I remained in a state of suspended animation, perched in a small weathered cottage on the edge of the Atlantic coast. The air here was salt-heavy and honest, a stark contrast to the filtered, curated atmosphere of the life I had just pruned away. I spent my mornings watching the tide, realizing that for 7 years I had been holding back a literal ocean of chaos for a man who didn't even know he was dry, while I was rediscovering the luxury of a cup of coffee that didn't have to be shared or scheduled. Mark's world was beginning to glitch with the frantic rhythm of a machine missing its primary gear. I knew exactly when the first dominoes fell because I had designed the system to fail the moment I stopped feeding it. My phone, which I kept on a nearby mahogany table, vibrated with a desperate, stuttering energy that I refused to acknowledge. It was the frantic digital pulse of a man discovering that his life was a locked room, and I was the only one who held the keys. The reports of his disintegration reached me in ripples of missed calls and urgent voicemails from the satellites orbiting his ego. His mother, a woman who had treated my presence like a permanent domestic appliance, left a message that vibrated with a mix of confusion and indignation. She had been waiting at the curb for her monthly oncology checkup, a task I had managed with clinical precision for 3 years, and Mark had simply forgotten she existed. He wasn't malicious. He was just functionally incompetent without my instructional design of his empathy. Then came the frantic pings from his office manager, a woman who sounded on the verge of a breakdown because the major tax filing I had meticulously prepared, the one that required Mark's specific manual signature on a hard copy form, was sitting in a locked drawer for which only I had the code. The satisfaction I felt wasn't a hot, impulsive heat. It was a cool, professional realization. I was watching a man who had mocked the idea of our relationship being serious finally grasp that he was a child who had been playing in a house built by a master architect. Without me, he didn't even know how to maintain the temperature of his own existence. He was realizing in real time that he hadn't been paying for a service. He had been living on borrowed brilliance. During that first week of recalibration, I found that aloneness was not the hollow ache I had been taught to fear. For a woman of 38 especially, one who had spent her youth shrinking to fit the spaces between a man's needs, solitude felt like a forgotten inheritance. I spent hours walking the shoreline, the cold water numbing my feet and sharpening my senses. I reflected on the myriad of ways I had softened my voice, delayed my own milestones, and edited my intellect to ensure Mark never felt eclipsed. I had been a project manager who treated her own life as a low-priority task. Now, in the quiet of the coastal rental, I was finally the primary stakeholder. This wasn't about loneliness. It was about the exquisite luxury of not being a utility. I was learning to breathe without checking if someone else needed the air first. I looked at my hands and realized they no longer had to be busy fixing someone else's mistakes to be considered valuable. I was reclaiming my time, my mental bandwidth, and my dignity, and the sheer weight of that freedom was more intoxicating than any romance I had ever known. On the 5th day, the silence was broken by a message that didn't vibrate with panic, but with the steady, familiar cadence of professional respect. It was from Julian, a man who had been a titan in the instructional design industry and a former mentor who had watched from the sidelines as I tethered myself to Mark's mediocre trajectory. Julian had always seen me not as a supportive partner, but as a strategic force. He didn't send a bouquet of flowers or a pitying note about the breakup. He sent a link to a private tender for a massive international educational project that needed a lead consultant with my specific lethal combination of tax expertise and organizational design. He wasn't offering me a shoulder to cry on. He was offering me a throne to sit upon. We met for dinner at a small discreet bistro in the village, the kind of place where the lighting was dim and the wine was older than my failed relationship. Julian looked at me across the table with an expression that contained no pity, only an invitation to return to the world I belonged in. He spoke to me as a peer, acknowledging the brilliance I had tried so hard to hide. It wasn't a rescue, it was a homecoming. As we sat there, the sunset casting a deep bruised purple over the water, I felt a sudden sharp impulse to mark the boundary between my past and my future. I took a single elegant photo of the table. The 2 glasses of dark red wine, the flickering candle, and a glimpse of Julian's sophisticated tailored sleeve in the periphery. It was a picture of a woman who was no longer waiting for permission to exist. I posted it to a new private social media account one I knew would be monitored by the circle of mutual friends who acted as Mark's informants. I didn't need to say a word. The image was a tactical strike. It telegraphed that I was not in mourning, I was not in hiding, and I was certainly not alone. I was with a man who represented everything Mark pretended to be: someone truly powerful, truly intelligent, and truly respected. I put my phone face down and returned to my conversation with Julian, feeling the final threads of my old life snapping one by one. I knew what would happen next. I knew the image would find its way to Mark's screen while he sat in our empty house, surrounded by the debris of his own mismanagement. Mark stared at the screen, realized he'd been replaced by a man he actually feared, and then the first IRS notice arrived in the mail. The chill of the coastal wind seemed to sharpen my memory, performing a cold surgical autopsy on the 7 years I had just interred. People might look at my departure and see a sudden impulsive flight, but the truth was far more clinical. I had been leaving Mark in increments for over 1,000 days. I sat in the quiet of my rental watching the gray Atlantic and realized that the grief people expected me to feel now was a ghost I had already lived with for years. I remembered the night 2 years ago when I received the Excellence in Design Award. I had come home glowing, holding the plaque like a hard-won piece of my soul, only for Mark to spend the entire dinner complaining about a minor scheduling conflict at his firm. He hadn't asked to see the award, nor had he poured a glass of wine to celebrate. He simply consumed the space in the room until my achievement felt like a small, inconvenient noise he had to talk over. Then there were the micro-betrayals of my time. The dozens of weekends I spent fixing his chaotic spreadsheets while he napped the way he would forget my dietary restrictions at dinner parties I hosted for his benefit, and the subtle, persistent way he redirected every conversation back to his own orbit. I hadn't abandoned him last Tuesday. I had simply stopped pretending that the hollow shell of our partnership was a living thing. This wasn't a sudden betrayal. It was the final formal recognition of a death that had occurred years ago. My coldness wasn't a mask. It was the temperature of a heart that had finally finished its mourning while still standing in the same room as the man who broke it. The contrast between that emotional desert and my current reality with Julian was like moving from a flickering candle to the noon sun. We were now 3 weeks into the high-stakes international project, and for the first time in a decade, I wasn't an invisible engine, I was the pilot. Sitting across from Julian in a glass-walled conference room, I watched as he actually listened. When I presented a complex architectural shift in the tax planning phase of the project, he didn't interrupt or try to claim the idea as a collaborative effort. He paused, processed my logic, and then integrated it into the larger strategy with a nod of genuine professional deference. I wasn't just in love with the work, I was in alignment with a peer. Julian didn't need me to curate his image or manage his ego. He wanted my brilliance because it complemented his own. My worth was being reflected back to me in a way that felt foreign yet deeply right. With Mark, I had been a servant disguised as a partner. With Julian, I was a strategist whose voice carried weight. The audience of my life had changed, and for the first time, I wasn't performing for a man who refused to applaud. I realized then that a real partnership doesn't require you to shrink so the other person can feel tall. It requires two people standing at their full height, looking at the same horizon. This newfound strength was tested when Mark's mother, Evelyn, finally managed to get through to me. She called on a Tuesday afternoon, her voice thick with the kind of practiced performative tears I had once fallen for. She spoke of Mark's misery of how the house was falling into disrepair and how he was lost without me. She tried to guilt-trip me with stories of his childhood and his need for a strong woman to keep him grounded. In the past, I would have softened offering to help from a distance or apologizing for the pain I was causing. But as I stood there looking out at the ocean, I felt nothing but a quiet, immovable firmness. I told her quite clearly that I had loved her son with everything I had, but that I had finally realized I was the only one doing the loving. I told her that she had spent 38 years teaching him how to be served, how to be the center of the universe, and how to expect the women in his life to function as his unpaid staff. But I added she had never once taught him how to be a partner. I told her that Mark didn't miss me. He missed the service I provided, and those were two very different things. The silence on the other end of the line was the sound of a generational cycle breaking. It was a mic drop moment I had waited years to deliver, not with anger, but with the weary authority of a woman who was done being a martyr for a man who didn't even know her name. As the days turned into weeks, the frantic energy Mark had been projecting through his friends and family began to settle into a desperate, singular focus. The system failure I had initiated was now a total blackout for him. He was discovering that the legacy system he had mocked was actually the only thing keeping his professional and personal reputation afloat. He was drowning in the minutiae I used to handle with a flick of my wrist, and the realization was finally shattering his ego. I watched my phone light up one final time as I sat on the deck of my cottage, the sun dipping below the horizon in a blaze of orange and gold. It was a direct call from him, no intermediaries, no flying monkeys. When Mark finally called begging for just 5 minutes of my time to explain things, I didn't feel the old tug of obligation or the spike of adrenaline I expected. Instead, I looked at his name on the screen and realized I couldn't even remember the sound of his voice, without feeling a profound, soul-deep sense of boredom. The boredom I felt as I stared at Mark's name on my screen was a quiet, final kind of death, but it was a death that heralded a very necessary resurrection. When I finally agreed to see him, it wasn't out of a lingering spark of hope or a need for closure. It was because my professional integrity demanded I officially hand over the final files of his chaotic financial life. He had used the guise of a tax crisis to lure me to a neutral cafe, claiming his new accountant had found irreparable discrepancies in the filings I had supposedly left behind. I knew better. I knew my work was flawless, and I knew this was the desperate gambit of a man who had realized that his life was a hollow shell without its architect. When I walked into that bistro, the contrast between us was so stark it felt almost cinematic. I felt radiant, my skin clear from the salt air, and my eyes bright with the thrill of the new international project I was leading with Julian. I looked 10 years younger because the weight of carrying a grown man's ego had finally been lifted from my shoulders. Mark, on the other hand, looked like a man who had been slowly evaporating. He was disheveled, his expensive suit slightly wrinkled, and there was a frantic aging desperation in the way he stood up when I approached. He tried to start with nostalgia, reaching for my hand and whispering about the good times and the anniversary we were supposed to be celebrating. I didn't pull away with a dramatic flourish. I simply placed my leather portfolio on the table between us, creating a physical and emotional barrier that he couldn't cross. I treated him exactly like a former client whose contract had been terminated for cause polite, professional, and entirely closed. I didn't give him the heat of anger because anger is still a form of investment. I gave him the chilling clinical air of a woman who had already finished the audit and found him wanting. Mark's attempts to use our shared history to pull me back were met with a calm, analytical silence that seemed to unsettle him more than any scream ever could. He started to apologize, his voice cracking as he admitted that he had taken me for granted, that he hadn't realized how much I did for him until the IRS letters started arriving and his house started falling apart. He begged for a chance to make it right, promising the marriage I had once asked for and the future I had once dreamed of. I let him finish, watching him with the detached curiosity of a scientist observing a failing experiment. Then I delivered the executive summary of our 7-year collapse. I explained to him in the same tone I used to break down complex tax codes that his fundamental error was a failure of perception. I told him that he had mistaken my patience for permanence and my silence for agreement. He had assumed that because I was capable of absorbing his neglect, I was willing to do so forever. I revealed that I had seen every small lie, every ego-driven dismissal, and every micro-betrayal over the last 3 years, but I had simply been waiting for the exact moment to exit the moment when his emotional and professional debt to me was at its absolute peak. I told him that I hadn't left because I was angry. I left because I had finally completed the cost-benefit analysis of our life together and realized he was a liability I could no longer afford to carry. The look on his face wasn't just heartbreak. It was the realization of a man who had been outplayed by the very person he thought he had successfully diminished. As he sat there shattered and reeling from the hard truth of my clarity, he tried one last desperate plea. He talked about our house and our future as if those things still existed in some parallel reality he could still inhabit. Just as he reached across the table to beg for another chance, my phone lit up with a notification that acted as the final decisive blow. It was a formal digital confirmation of a property closing a stunning mid-century modern home I had just purchased with Julian, not as a domestic refuge, but as the headquarters for our new joint consultancy firm. It was a message about building an empire, a future that was already under construction, while Mark was still trying to figure out how to pay his overdue water bill. I didn't hide the screen. I let him see the notification, let him see the name of the man who now stood where he once did. He saw that while he had been waiting for me to calm down and come crawling back to his mediocrity, I had been busy architecting a life of true power and mutual respect. He realized then that the arrangement he had mocked was the only thing that had ever made him feel like a success. Without me, he wasn't just lonely, he was irrelevant. He was a man standing in the wreckage of a life he had been too arrogant to realize someone else had built for him. He looked at the radiant, formidable woman sitting across from him and realized he wasn't mourning a girlfriend he had lost. Mark realized he wasn't mourning a woman. He was mourning the life he was too arrogant to realize she had built for him. The transition from the shadow of Mark's life into the light of my own was not a leap of faith. It was the final flawless execution of a long-term strategic plan. 6 months after our final meeting at the cafe, I stood in my new office, a space defined by expansive glass sharp lines and an atmosphere of profound intellectual respect. This was the headquarters of the consultancy Julian and I had built a partnership that felt less like a romance and more like a high-performance engine where every part was valued. There was no saving in this relationship, no emotional labor required to keep a partner's ego afloat. Instead, there was a constant, exhilarating exchange of ideas. Julian didn't need me to manage his schedule or protect him from his own mistakes. He wanted me by his side because my vision challenged him to be better. I looked at the international project we had just successfully launched and realized that Mark had been a necessary, albeit painful, catalyst. He was the friction that forced me to discover my own strength, the legacy system that had to fail so I could finally build something built to last. I hadn't just survived the last 7 years. I had used them as raw material to construct a professional and personal masterpiece. Every micro-betrayal and every moment of being treated as a utility had been documented and converted into the wisdom that now allowed me to lead with unshakable authority. I was finally in alignment, not because I had found the right man, but because I had finally become the right woman for myself. Mark's fate as it reached me through the occasional ripple in our old social circles was exactly what I had predicted, the slow, inevitable erosion of a man who had mistaken his support system for his own talent. He wasn't destitute or ruined in any cinematic sense. He was simply diminished. I heard he was dating a woman in her late 20s, someone who was captivated by the charismatic facade he still managed to project at cocktail parties. But the stories I heard told a different tale of his daily reality. Without my management, his house had become a cluttered monument to his procrastination, and his professional reputation was quietly fraying at the edges as he missed deadlines and fumbled the delicate tax maneuvers I used to handle in my sleep. His new girlfriend didn't know how to navigate the IRS. She didn't know how to curate his image, and quite frankly, she found his constant need for validation exhausting. He was a man living in the aftermath of a greatness he had never actually earned, clinging to a lifestyle he no longer had the infrastructure to maintain. The audience of our old life watched him struggle and finally understood the truth. Mark hadn't been the architect of his success. He had been the tenant, and he had been evicted by the owner. The weight of his own mediocrity was now his constant companion, a permanent reminder that some assets once lost can never be replaced. Looking back on this journey, I realized that the most profound revenge isn't found in a dramatic confrontation or a public downfall. It is found in the quiet, absolute restoration of one's own dignity. I find myself wanting to speak to every woman who has ever felt her light dimming while she fuels someone else's fire. I want them to understand the terrifying beauty of the exit strategy. We are taught that loyalty is a virtue, but loyalty without reciprocity is nothing more than self-abandonment. The most powerful thing any of us can do is to stop being a background character in a story that refuses to acknowledge our name. We are not convenient arrangements, and we are certainly not legacy systems waiting for an upgrade. We are the authors, the architects, and the primary stakeholders of our own lives. My calm, my success, and my refusal to look back are the final enduring forms of victory. I spent 7 years being the ghost in Mark's machine, but in the end, I was the one who walked away with the power. I learned that clarity often arrives disguised as a loss, and that the most important audit you will ever perform is the one where you finally decide what your own life is worth. I sit on the deck of my home now watching the sun set over a horizon that I chose for myself. There is no one to manage, no ego to stroke, and no silence to interpret. There is only the steady rhythmic pulse of a life lived in full view. I think about the note I left on the kitchen island that night and the woman who wrote it. She was brave, yes, but more importantly, she was done. She was done being the invisible engine of a man who didn't deserve to move forward. She was done waiting for a seat at a table that she had already built with her own hands. The world told me that leaving after 7 years was a failure, but I know it was my greatest achievement. It was the moment I stopped being a utility and started being a human being. The peace I feel now is not the absence of struggle. It is the presence of self-recognition. Some women don't leave because they're angry. They leave because staying would require them to disappear, and I finally decided that I deserved to be seen. If you felt a spark of recognition while listening to Sarah's journey, it is because her story belongs to so many of us who have spent years building empires for people who only saw us as the furniture. Sarah's victory wasn't just in leaving, but in refusing to let her brilliance be buried under someone else's ego. Now I want to hear from you. Have you ever reached that breaking point where you realized your loyalty had become your cage? Or perhaps you are currently standing at the edge wondering if you have the strength to execute your own exit strategy. Many of our viewers have shared that the moment they stopped being the silent engine for an ungrateful partner was the moment their real life finally began. Your experiences are the heartbeat of this community, and your insights might be the exact words someone else needs to hear today to find their own courage. If you believe that no woman should ever have to disappear just to keep a relationship alive, then join our community. Subscribe to the channel so you never miss these stories of reclamation and psychological strength. By hitting that subscribe button and sharing your thoughts in the comments below, you help us ensure that these voices are never silenced again. Let's continue the conversation and support one another in choosing a life where we are finally seen.